U.S. secret bioweapons program. Faced with a deep recession in an election year, President Donald Trump has increasingly blamed China for the coronavirus pandemic.
It came from China. It should have been stopped. It could have been stopped on the spot. They chose not to do it, or something happened. Either there was incompetence or they didn't do it for some reason. And we're going to have to find out what that reason was.
Trump has said China should have been more active in letting the world know about the virus much sooner. The Republican president has also accused Beijing of weaponizing the virus to hurt his re-election prospects.
I don't want to put cast any dispersions. I just will tell you that China would like to see sleepy Joe Biden. They would take this country for a ride like you've never seen.
The U.S. is reportedly crafting a long-term plan to punish China on multiple fronts, jeopardizing a critical relationship already on a steep downward slide. Trump has threatened to reignite the trade war with China, ignoring warnings that it could hit the global economy as the world heads for the worst recession since the Great Depression in the 1930s. Why is Trump escalating tensions with China?
And there's been a rising tension between China and the United States internationally for quite a number of years here. And it's basically over questions of economic interest, control of natural resources, control of trade routes, and so forth.
Escalating tensions even further, President Trump has claimed there is evidence the coronavirus has originated at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, a claim Beijing has vehemently rejected.
We're looking at exactly where it came from, who it came from, how it happened, separately and also scientifically. So we're going to be able to find it.
And my question is, have you seen anything at this point that gives you a high degree of confidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the origin of this virus?
Yes, I have. Yes, I have.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was even more explicit in accusing Beijing.
Martha, there's enormous evidence that that's where this began. We've said from the beginning that this was a virus that originated in Wuhan, China. We took a lot of grief for that from the outset, but I think the whole world can see now. Remember, China has a history of infecting the world.
The claim contradicts the judgment of U.S. intelligence agencies, the World Health Organization, and most virologists. The Office of Director of National Intelligence has issued a statement saying it concurs with the widespread scientific consensus that the COVID-19 virus was not man-made or genetically modified.
You believe it was man-made or genetically modified?
Look, the best experts so far seem to think it was man-made. I have no reason to disbelieve that at this point.
Why is the Trump administration contradicting U.S. intelligence and medical experts who say the virus was not man-made?
Now, Donald Trump is wrong, in my view, in simply holding China responsible for all of the circumstantial evidence that suggests that it may be a bioweapon, because there are other players involved with the Wuhan Institute of Virology that Mr. Trump doesn't want named, because it would begin to expose the amount of Western involvement and American involvement specifically in the bioweapons research and deployment industry.
Regardless of the origin of the coronavirus, the pandemic may have exposed a much more dangerous threat, a biowarfare arms race. While China hawks have singled out Chinese lab work as uniquely worrisome, experts say America's bioweapons program is far more dangerous. What are biological weapons, and why are they so dangerous?
Biological threats are about the deliberate misuse of science for hostile purposes, and we're specifically talking about disease and infection. Some of the areas that we're particularly worried about are gene editing technologies, gain-of-function technologies, where you are deliberately creating potentially pandemic pathogens in the lab. Fortunately, there is a multinational treaty completely prohibiting biological weapons.
The challenge for the Biological Weapons Convention is that there is no check to make sure that signatories are complying with the treaty.
The development of biological weapons anywhere in the world. Instead of finger pointing, they just need to be made illegal.
American bioweapons labs operate in secret, are largely self-policing, and are also known to be accident-prone.
There's another player involved in this as well. There is a Dr. Charles Lieber, who is the head of Harvard's Chemical and Biochemical Department, who is a dual citizen of Israel and who was arrested some weeks ago by the FBI for being involved with this Wuhan Institute of Virology and helping them allegedly to recruit the people who in fact stole these materials from this Canadian bioweapons lab in Winnipeg, and that Dr. Lieber was so concerned about his own situation that there are credible reports that he and his wife were going to attempt to flee to Israel when their passports were confiscated by the American authorities. Now, we have heard nothing from American mainstream media about this outfit in Winnipeg, Manitoba. The whole situation of Dr. Charles Lieber and his own connections to Israeli intelligence and NanoSys and the Hebrew Institute of Jerusalem have all been buried by mainstream media for obvious reasons.
The US government has for long refused even to negotiate monitoring its biological weapons. Could the US trigger a biowarfare arms race by accusing China of developing the coronavirus in a laboratory?
I think that's entirely possible, and to understand this, we go back to what the late Alan Dulles said, the one-time head of the CIA, in talking about covert operations. He said that the constitutional scrutiny of intelligence agencies is largely an illusory concept. He said if the insiders are good, they fool the outsiders, and if they're bad, they fool themselves. When we look at this whole issue of bioweapons, we start looking at nuclear weapons, we start looking at the CIA's MK Ultra mind control program of years ago, which even included the use of psychedelic drugs on unsuspecting people. It's abundantly clear that whatever it is that the United States is doing in Fort Detrick, Maryland, with its own bioweapons program, the American people are not going to know about it. The mainstream media is certainly not going to cover it. And we start asking where Congress is on all this. They're nowhere to be found.
The possibility of mishaps at institutions working with the world's most dangerous pathogens is a great cause for concern. Officials at the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have identified several cases of bioterror pathogens being mishandled at laboratories that have not been disclosed to congressional investigators.
Smallpox was one of the most frightening diseases the world has known. It killed at least 300 million people in the last century before it was eradicated. So it came as quite a surprise when the U.S. government revealed yesterday that vials of smallpox had been forgotten for decades and were just discovered in a cardboard box.
I will not be surprised if one or more of these samples contains live growing smallpox virus.
High-profile accidents with anthrax, smallpox, and Ebola have raised concerns about the safety of American laboratories. Experts say they could set off pandemics much deadlier than the coronavirus.
It seems to me that we need to emphasize for everyone involved that when you're dealing with this kind of weaponry, this kind of research, this whole issue of so-called weapons of mass destruction with the people who really have the weapons of mass destruction, which is not Saddam Hussein, by the way, the late Saddam Hussein, but principally the government of the United States and Israel, among other major players.
The United States began working on its secretive bioweapons program during World War II. The U.S. proceeded to build up a large stockpile of biological agents and weapons.
The United States responded to the perceived threats from Germany and Japan. In 1943, we began an offensive biological program with a modest research and development facility at Camp Detrick, which is now Fort Detrick, Maryland. By the end of the program, we had weaponized a total of 7 incapacitating or lethal human agents.
The program continued for 27 years until President Richard Nixon ended all offensive aspects of the U.S. bioweapons program in 1969.
That the United States of America will renounce the use of any form of deadly biological weapons that either kill or incapacitate.
However, the program only went further underground. The US has continued research into deadly pathogens at various military laboratories, including at Fort Detrick, the US Army's main biological warfare laboratory. Throughout the history of the secret program, the US has used or tested biological weapons in many parts of the world, including in Africa, Vietnam, Cuba, North Korea, and even in Europe.
Why don't you describe for me, as vividly as you can, what it is you're worried about, what it is that the nightmare scenario looks like?
Fortunately, there's very few things, and most of them are very low probability. Some big volcanic explosion, gigantic earthquake, asteroid. At least in the nuclear case, you've got to say we take it quite seriously. We budget a lot of money, have a lot of people who think about nuclear deterrence, and I'm very glad that work's been done.
Since the 9/11 attacks, funding for bioweapons research has soared without any oversight. Why has the US revived its secret bioweapons program?
Basically, what you have here is a situation where whether we talk about 9/11 or we now talk about COVID-19, what is the end game and the end result of all of this? It results in an increase in monies for the American national security establishment and for the intelligence community. It results in new levels of draconian involvement on the part of the American government in creating a domestic police state at home, at the same time that Americans' opportunities to travel abroad and to meet with the people they want to meet with and to attend conferences and so forth is oftentimes curtailed for political reasons with countries that we are not at war with.
The US military has a history of testing biological and microbiological pathogens on American soil. In 1951, the US Navy dispersed fungal spores in the Norfolk Naval Supply Center in Virginia to see how they would infect workers, who happened to be mostly African Americans. Another test saw zinc-cadmium sulfide being sprayed over St. Louis and Minneapolis to determine the geographical range of biological agents. Bioweapons testing was ramped up in 1962 when the Pentagon authorized a controversial program named Project 112. As part of the project, certain bacteria were injected into the New York subway system in 1966, infecting many civilians.
The fact is that whether we're looking at these outlandish bioweapons experiments that took place in the New York subway system, or we're looking at a situation where the United States was testing tactical nuclear warheads and explosions in the presence of their own conventional troops, many of whom subsequently died of radiation and cancer. We're looking at MK Ultra or Operation Northwoods or any of these other outrages that continue right up to the present period of time. There's really none of this that would surprise me whatsoever.
The US government has acknowledged that tens of thousands of civilians might have been exposed to bioagents thanks to its bioweapons research.
We do know that some civilians were exposed in tests that occurred in Hawaii, possibly in Alaska, and possibly in Florida.
Since the Cold War, the US has developed a clandestine network of biological laboratories from Europe to Africa to Southeast Asia. In 2018, Russia's Defense Ministry revealed that the United States appeared to be running a secret biological weapons laboratory in the country of Georgia, posing a direct security threat to Russia. Moscow said the laboratory was part of a network of US labs near the borders of Russia and China. Why is the United States running so many clandestine bioweapons laboratories across the world? Should the international community be worried?
It really begs the question as to what kind of teeth the international community has at all in regulating some of these activities. Obviously, the United States Congress and the United States Senate aren't doing anything to regulate these activities. The fact is that the so-called international community is completely toothless in this regard, because the United States can always thumb its nose, and usually does thumb its nose at these people.
Trump covering his tracks. The COVID-19 death toll could get much worse in the United States thanks to a president who is much more concerned about his re-election than the welfare of citizens. Trump is desperate to reopen the economy as soon as possible and boost his re-election chances. In just a few weeks, the death toll surpassed all the deaths America suffered in all the years of the Vietnam War. This is what the president's son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner has called a success story.
The federal government rose to the challenge, and this is a great success story. And I think that that's really, what needs to be told.
Epidemiologists say that up to 90% of U.S. deaths could have been avoided if the government had taken measures just 2 weeks earlier than it did. That puts the spotlight on a president who received a dozen classified intelligence briefings in January and February about the novel coronavirus, but chose to ignore them. All the while, Trump continued to downplay the threat, discarding the virus as a deep state conspiracy designed to bring him down.
Now, the virus that we're talking about having to do, a lot of people think that goes away in April with the heat. Because of all we've done, the risk to the American people remains very low. People die from the flu, and this is very unusual. And it is a little bit different, but in some ways it's easier, and in some ways it's a little bit tougher. But we have it so well under control. View this the same as the flu. When somebody sneezes, I try and bail out as much as possible. It's going to disappear. One day it's like a miracle, it will disappear.
Americans have already suffered enormously from Trump's initial downplaying of COVID-19. Will they suffer again from his desire for the country to get back to business sooner than it should?
Now, those of us who follow these economic developments knew ahead of time that another economic crash is due in the United States and all developed countries, in fact. And I believe that the pandemic crisis was calculated to distract attention from the draconian measures that would be taken to deal with the economic crisis, to lock people down in their houses, keep them helpless and so forth, while the economic fix went on, very much to the advantage of big banks and so forth, and very much to the disadvantage of the bulk of the people.
It should come as no surprise that the Trump administration is desperately trying to stop the truth from coming out. It has engaged in a campaign of disinformation and conspiracy theories while ramping up attacks on China. The White House has blocked America's top scientist, Dr. Anthony Fauci, from testifying before Congress on the subject of the government's response to the pandemic.
The New York Times reported yesterday that you and other top officials wanted to recommend social and physical distancing guidelines to President Trump as far back as the third week of February, but the administration didn't announce such guidelines to the American public until March 16th, almost a month later. Why?
Jake, as I've said many times, we look at it from a pure health standpoint. We make a recommendation. Often the recommendation is taken. Sometimes it's not. But it is what it is. We are where we are right now.
Do you think lives could have been saved if social distancing, physical distancing, stay-at-home measures had started third week of February instead of mid-March?
Jake, again, it's the what would have, what could have.
Trump has also replaced the Inspector General for the Department of Health and Human Services, Christy Grimm, who brought public attention to critical shortages in medical supplies. It seems that the Trump administration is doing everything possible to cover its tracks.
And the problem is that with both the number of deaths and with the prevalence not being available, it's very difficult to make any sense of the other questions that you've raised. And that's the problem. Again, that's a consequence of the politicization of this disease. It's, rather than treating it as a medical matter. So that's, again, we get back to this basic problem of politicization.
The coronavirus outbreak is exposing not only the political divide in America, but its social vulnerabilities all at the same time. Reports show that neo-Nazi groups are looking for ways to exploit the outbreak to push their agenda and recruit new members. Although the anti-lockdown protests that have broken out across America have drawn out people from all walks of life, the presence of extremists and white supremacists cannot be missed.
How did they come up with this number of 6 feet?
Law enforcement officials report a rise in violent incidents committed by white supremacists angry over aspects of the pandemic response. The extremists are encouraging their loyalists to conduct acts of violence in their communities. Their messaging often occurs on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. President Trump has made the matter worse by politicizing the stay-at-home orders.
I think a lot of people want to go back. They just want to go back. You see it every day. You see demonstrations all over the country, and those are meaningful demonstrations. Oh, it's big stuff.
Last month, Trump urged his supporters to liberate Minnesota, Michigan, and Virginia, 3 swing states that are run by Democratic governors and crucial to his re-election bid.
I've had enough of being told what I can and cannot do. I've had enough of worrying about bills and making money.
Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, a Democrat, said the armed protesters who stormed the state's capital depicted some of the worst racism in U.S. history. But President Trump called the protesters very good people. Will the United States be even more divided once the outbreak is over?
I think what's happening is that people feel that their businesses and livelihoods are being threatened, and that's the immediate cause of these protests, bringing guns to these protests. I'm not in favor of that, as I say, because there are plenty of other people with plenty of other grievances who wouldn't want to do that, and I would caution people, they should go and they should protest. They have a right to express their grievances, but certainly bringing the guns is very counterproductive and very confusing of the issue, I think.